All right, today we have Mark Russo of our Habitat program. We'll be talking about the Yarmouth artificial reef and all the work that's been done in the past. So take it away, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Gary, and thanks for the opportunity to use this forum to share the work of my program. My name is Mark Russo, and I'm DMF Habitat Program Lead, and today I'm going to discuss 5 decades of DMF effort in the development of the Yarmouth artificial reef. Full disclosure, I'm old, but I'm not that old. So I have not been involved in all 5 decades of this work, but I will present to you some file information that we have on this site for work that was done earlier. So a little background, DMF's Artificial Reef Project is one of many components of the Fisheries Habitat Program. The program consists of staff working out of both the Gloucester and New Bedford offices, and the goal of the program is to protect and enhance marine fisheries resources. The program works to address goals primarily through technical review and fisheries habitat research. Under technical review, we review permits for coastal construction projects and provide recommendations to avoid or minimize impacts to marine fisheries resources. Staff also participate on various working groups and provide technical analysis and policy input on a variety of topics, including ocean planning, offshore wind development, and mitigation. Under Fisheries Habitat Research, the program conducts state and grant-funded research related to marine fisheries habitats and utilize staff expertise in mapping, restoration, and monitoring to address habitat research needs. Today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on DMF's collaborative efforts on an artificial reef in Nantucket Sound. The talk will provide some general background information on reefs and summarize efforts over time in the development of the Yarmouth artificial reef and provide some lessons learned and some potential next steps. So what is an artificial reef? An artificial reef is a man-made underwater structure built for the purpose of promoting marine life in areas of generally featureless bottom. It's a habitat conversion. So in the development of reefs, you must avoid and minimize impacts to other important habitats. And it involves a variety of different structures and techniques, depending on where you are and what your goals are. Historically, artificial reefs have been used to increase fish yields dating back to the 17th century in Japan, and the earliest recorded artificial reef in the United States is from the 1830s in South Carolina, where logs were used to create submerged structures to improve fishing. It's also important to note what artificial reefs are not, and for the purposes of this discussion, we won't be talking about shipwrecks, and we won't be talking about groins, jetties, breakwaters, or other engineered emergent structures designed primarily for shoreline protection. And it's certainly not an opportunity for ocean dumping. So in Massachusetts, building artificial reefs is consistent with the mission of DFG and DMF to enhance the Commonwealth's natural resources and to provide outdoor recreation opportunities to the public. There are 5 reefs in Massachusetts, 2 mitigation reefs in Boston Harbor region, a reef ball site, experimental reef ball site in off the coast of Dartmouth, and 2 reefs in Nantucket Sound. The 2 Nantucket Sound reefs remain open and available to accept additional materials. And the program currently has no dedicated funding and relies on collaborative efforts and small amounts of outside funding to conduct reef work. And this work is all opportunistic and collaborative. And so what does that mean? Why is there a demand for artificial reef in Massachusetts? Primarily because it is economically important to coastal communities. A 2014 survey conducted by the National Marine Fisheries Service found over 1 million anglers expend more than $1.2 billion annually in Massachusetts, generating more than 11,000 jobs for the Commonwealth. So the challenge becomes, how do we site, design, permit, and deploy artificial reefs without any dedicated funding sources? And regionally, artificial reefs are recognized, beyond just Massachusetts, as a tool to enhance habitat and for their economic value. Artificial reef development in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast has more than doubled since an Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission report released in 1988 profiling artificial reef development along the East Coast. But today I'm just going to be focusing on the Yarmouth Artificial Reef, which is Massachusetts' oldest reef. The presentation will review collaborative efforts and continued development of the Yarmouth Reef spanning almost 50 years. And so what does opportunistic and collaborative look like? It involves a lot of players. In this case, the town of Yarmouth, the Cape Cod Salties, Mass Bay Transit Authority, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, the U.S. Coast Guard, Northeastern University, Mass Department of Transportation, Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute, Department of Fish and Game, Yarmouth Department of Natural Resources, and others have all contributed in some way to either acquiring materials, deploying materials, or monitoring and research of the Yarmouth Reef over time. At this point, I have a couple of slides that I'm going to parse into decades. So I'll show you a few slides highlighting the work in the 70s and the 80s, and then a few more slides highlighting the work from the 90s and the 2000s, and then a few more slides from 2000 on. So right now we're going to focus on the 70s and the 80s. So these are the locust map and plan view images that were submitted to the Army Corps for permitting in late 1977. These were on file, and I find them to be somewhat entertaining in that they're handwritten, and somebody drew a big circle on the map to the left, put an X in it, and that's where they decided to place this reef. And for permitting purposes back in 1977, that was acceptable, and as well as the hand-drawn um, uh, the hand-drawn permit document to the right, which depicts the tire units that were initially deployed. So things have changed quite a bit since then, and permitting is much more complex. But I just thought it would be interesting to show this. And so this is a really bad slide, but it's intentionally that way. There's two images here taken in the late 70s, early 80s. The picture on top, I'll point out that orange piece is the top of somebody's snorkel, and there's also a hand in the picture up. This is a diver that's monitoring a couple of tire reefs that were deployed, I think in 1978. In the lower image, again, is a couple of tires with a small black sea bass in the image as well. And these are the tools that were used and employed back in the late 70s, early 80s. There was no sophisticated digital equipment to collect data at that time. So limited imagery exists from these deployments. There was no GPS, so finding these proved to be fairly difficult early on. And in fact, some of the early records that we have on file indicate that sextants were used to position the boat to assist the divers in finding where these units were deployed. This was a collaborative effort between the town of Yarmouth and DMF early on, and they were documented by a series of field memos that were in the file between 1980 and 1985. And so what we know, these field memos were written by a woman named Elizabeth Amaral and Arnie Carr, both DMF employees, to the DMF Assistant Director, Randy Fairbanks, and Alan Peterson, who was the director at the time. There was some back and forth with CZM and the Army Corps of Engineers before work commenced, but the first deployments occurred on August 23rd, 1978. Folks from the town of Yarmouth that were involved, most notably was a gentleman by the name of Mo Johnson. Um, Juvenile scup and black sea bass were noted at the site by divers prior to the deployment, and the first deployment consisted of 14 tire units that were deployed using a contracted dragger. The second dive was on September 29th when 216 additional units were deployed. And finally, it's noted in the files that by November 10th, an additional 225 units were deployed. And tautog and black sea bass were observed on the site, as well as a barnacle set on all deployed materials was observed at that time. Another interesting note in the file was that after that November 10th dive, the next dive didn't occur until May 3rd, 1979, due to ice conditions in Nantucket Sound, which moved a marker buoy that they deployed at the center of the site off the location that first year. In addition to several fish species that were already noted, red algae colonization was also noted, as well as evidence of angler use on and around clustered tire units, primarily in the northwest portion of the permitted site. The strapping, and we'll get into the strapping and how these units were designed later on, but all those things were noted to be intact. And tire deployments continued by the town sporadically until 1983. And that really is the extent of what we have for information on the early years of the reef. Now I'm going to move into the 90s and the 2000s. We saw additional tires deployed to the site, but most importantly, there was an increase in DMF's technological capacity to monitor and assess artificial reefs. Was developed during this period. Also, during this time, the Commonwealth was involved in the creation of 3 additional artificial reefs: the Sculpin Ledge Reef in Boston Harbor, the Hubline Reef in Boston Harbor, and the Dartmouth Reef Ball Reef, experimental reef ball reef in collaboration with UMass Dartmouth. During this period, the Division of Marine Fisheries also completed an artificial reef plan to be used for future reef development. So here's an image, some earlier images back 1995 of some DMF staff preparing to conduct a side scan sonar survey, launching out of the Bass River site in Yarmouth. I believe the folks on the boat are recently retired Vin Melkowski, as well as Paul Caruso and Arnie Carr. Arnie Carr is the person in the center, and he's leaning over a device, which is a printer that printed out side scan sonar imagery as it was being collected. I believe it was likely that they were using Loran to navigate to and from the site at this time. And this is another interesting group of photos here. The top left shows the side scan sonar towfish, as well as Arnie Carr, who was the sort of the father of side scan sonar survey work here at Mass Marine Fisheries. And the rest of the images are photographs of the paper copies that I have rolled up in a tube in my office. The only thing that indicates that these were from the reef is that they reference tire units, but there's no spatial orientation associated with these, nor is there any date on these. So at some point, we'll try and maybe generate some point data on where the tires exist in these units and see if we can't compare them to later side scan sonar survey work that we've done that has digitized imagery. And this effort took place in 1995 in advance of reopening the permit for additional materials to be deployed to the site. And this is where the Cape Cod salties come in. There's 3 images here of Cape Cod salties constructing these tire units at what looks to be maybe a transfer station or a landfill site in one of the Cape Cod communities. Uh, the top the top left shows a group of tires being banded with a metal strap. The bottom left shows um, the branding of the tire. All of these units had to have a distinct marking on it. So in the event that they washed up on shore, they could be traced back to this activity. And then the photo on the right is a series of already banded tire units um, prepared for being loaded onto a boat for deployment. The permit in 1995, when it was um, refiled, called for another 1,000 tire units to be deployed to the site. And here's how they did that. This was the Pelican, which looks like to be a surplus World War II vessel, where they loaded these on, brought them out to the site, and then deployed them off the side. I'm not sure who the gentleman is on the right. There is reference to a couple of folks from the town of Yarmouth in some of the field notes, Mo Johnson or Paul Montague. It may be one of them. I've never met them, so I'm not sure. Um, and I want to take a pause here because I'm sure there's some questions about why tires. 1995 was the last batch of tires to be deployed to the site. Conventional thinking around the utility of tires as marine habitat started shifting around this time, and we no longer consider tires as suitable for materials for reefing. Um, this this stems from some problems they had with some tire reefs created in other parts of the country. But unlike those areas, these tires, the banding, the branding, and also along with that, they drilled holes into these tires and ballasted them with concrete so that they would expel air when they were deployed, as well as they would be a little bit heavier and weighted onto the bottom from the concrete and allow them to stay in place over time. There was also concerns about their ability to attract fouling organisms. And you can see by the two pictures here, although they're not good pictures, but they are pictures that these tire units are sufficiently fouled and are serving as habitat in some capacity for fish. There haven't been any discussions on removal of these units from the site as they're currently functioning as proposed. There was also some concerns locally that trying to remove these from the site might actually generate more harm than good if not managed appropriately. So, and they remain in place, and we have several side scans. So in our surveys, that can document the fact that they haven't moved in, going on almost 50 years now. So now I'm going to get into sort of the 2010s and 2020s and some of the more recent work um, that's most people here might be a little bit more familiar with. During this time, there's been substantial expansion of our mapping and monitoring capabilities here at DMF. And so hopefully some of that comes into play in the subsequent slides. In 2010, in preparation for reopening the permit again to accept additional materials, but not tires this time, we hired Arnie Carr to bring us out and conduct a side scan sonar survey again of the site. This is post all tire deployments, and the image on the right shows aggregations of tire units based on a point analysis that we conducted in GIS. The black lines represent areas that we established for further ground truthing using diver surveys along transects. And so here are the 2010 monitoring using divers. And I thought it would be important to put these slides up to note a couple of things. First of all, almost 100% fouling on all of the tires. There's no exposed rubber at all. And some diverse colonizers, including sponges on the top left and soft corals on the bottom right. Those typically take some time to colonize. So that's another further indication that these things have remained in place for quite a long time. And as far as materials go, the Cape Cod Salties, again, were very active in identifying materials to be deployed to the site through a couple of different processes. The first one was there was a local drive-in movie theater in town that was subject to some redevelopment, and the site itself was lined with a bunch of granite blockings that the contractor was willing to donate to the Salties for use as structured habitat on the artificial reef site. So they were able to secure I think it was 750 cubic yards of granite material, as well as with the help of Ed Clark and some other DMF staff, they put together a concrete mold, and they designed top left. You can see that that triangular pyramid shaped thing with the DMF on it. Um, they they um, they built about 13 or 14 of those to be deployed on the site, and they were deployed in 2022. Although, in the work that our staff has done to date on the site monitoring, we have yet to come across one of them. So they're out there, and we'd be interested in talking to somebody that's seen them. So it's a good sort of scavenger hunt. Um, Another big material acquisition component was the utilization of the Clean Energy Center in New Bedford. We were able, through an MOU, to establish 1 acre of that site as a holding area for materials. Concurrent to that, we also entered into an MOU with the Mass Department of Transportation and the Mass Bays Transit Authority, the work that they were doing on the South Coast Terminal to replace the rail lines involved, upgrading all the bridges and culverts along that line, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 culverts and bridges, dating back to the 1800s. So all the granite material that they had to replace through that process was donated um, to the site and stored at the Clean Energy Center site. It's a little hard to see, but that square box represents 1 acre, an aerial view of what all that material looked like once it was housed at the site. And that's material stayed there for a couple of years until it was deployed. We're going to get into deployments next. Um, One of the things that we've learned with deployments is there's really no suitable infrastructure port side on Cape Cod for loading reef materials. So it necessitates transporting materials. In the case of the drive-in movie theater, granted, it necessitated transporting that material over land to New Bedford or Fall River to be loaded on barges. That was represents a significant increase in deployment costs. And so that is, one area that we'd be looking to address sort of going forward as lessons learned and next steps. We also have a continued collaboration between DMF and the U.S. Coast Guard involving several U.S. Coast Guard stations responsible for maintaining navigational aids, with the most recent efforts involving U.S. Coast Guard Station Sandy Hook and U.S. Coast Guard Station Woods Hole, where they donate navigational aid mooring blocks that have exceeded their usable lifespan as a mooring to the artificial reef site. We have designated a specific site within the site for those materials to be dropped off. We've had several deployments over the past few years and expect that to continue going forward. So to summarize in terms of the material acquisitions, the no-cost materials have not been a significant limiting factor in reef deployments. We haven't had to pay for a lot of materials. and areas like the Clean Energy Center, if we could identify areas like that going forward for future use, it will really help us reduce costs for handling and transportation experienced uh, during some of our most recent deployments to the Yarmouth Reef. 2022, all those materials, like I described earlier, through collaborations with DOT and the Clean Energy Center and the Mass Department of Fish and Game in particular, who provided some funding to deploy that material. We were able to put almost 5,000 cubic yards across 2 different reef sites, including the Yarmouth site. That was the last big deployment that we've had. Um, After every large deployment, we conduct a side scan sonar survey of the site as part of our permit compliance to assess not only the spatial placement of materials, but to ensure that we're in compliance with the height off the bottom stipulated in our permit, which indicates that the materials cannot exceed 6 feet off the bottom for navigation purposes. So the image on the left here is a pre-deployment survey, and the image on the right is a post-deployment survey. And you can see in both images, we've circled where the previous aggregations of tire reefs were, as well as the areas where new materials were deployed. I also wanted to point out in this image, you'll notice that the image on the left, the track lines are a little scattered, and the track lines on the right are very straight. That's the result of installing autopilot on our 2 large research vessels, the Alosa and the Maya, which greatly enhance our capability to effectively um, conduct side scan sonar surveys on some real discrete track lines. So DMF monitoring, also a collaborative effort, and involves a lot of different sensing equipment, acoustic receivers, temperature monitors, as well as diver surveys, and video imagery, and what we call BRUV, which is baited remote underwater video surveys, which is that picture on the left. Um, the monitoring itself, it consists of both compliance monitoring and performance monitoring for permitting purposes, or for funding purposes. The compliance monitoring is primarily for permitting. The performance monitoring is primarily for funding. And over the last several years, we've relied on contributions in the neighborhood of $10,000 or less from the Marine Recreational Fisheries Development Fund, to help us monitor not only the Yarmouth Reef, but all the reef sites in Massachusetts, all 5 of them. And we visit every reef site at a minimum of at least once a year. This is a very interesting image just to sort of expand on our capabilities with side scan sonar. I thought it would be good to point out, on the bottom of the image, there are 2 side scan sonar tracks, a pre and a post track, as well as a screenshot from our depth sounder on board, and you can see the elevation changes off the bottom. And then the profile on the top is 2 tracks, a pre and a post side scan survey bottom profile, and you can see the purple and the green spikes here represent structure that was deployed in that area. We've collaborated with several groups, including the Cape Cod Salties, as well as Northeastern University and other regional scientists on some of our monitoring efforts. I think I've gone over most of what's on this slide already. Yeah, there's if you're looking for additional information on our monitoring efforts around artificial reefs, there's a couple links in this slide. So if this becomes available later on, you can click on those links and go to the Marine Fisheries YouTube channel to see some videos of our monitoring or see some of the publications from our publications page as well. No single monitoring technique is going to ever tell the whole story. And that's why we incorporate so many different techniques and continue to look at other avenues to explore to enhance our data collection capabilities at all these reef sites. So we've talked about side scan sonar survey, and you've seen a little bit of how that has evolved since the 90s. We've done diver surveys that has also assessing mobile ancestral species at the site. And that has also come a long way with technology for things like digital cameras and our ability to utilize GIS to visit the identical sites repetitively. There are other techniques we use include photo ground truthing and acoustic receivers is something that we have installed on all our um, artificial reefs sites, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. We also deploy bottom temperature loggers for continuous time series temperature data. I talked a little bit about the BRUV work, the baited remote underwater videos. We're also exploring the utility of eDNA to help us identify finfish species composition. Right now, we're looking at finfish. It could be other categories later on, and we also have incorporated the mass coastal zone management mimic protocols to assess invasive species at the reef sites, particularly in areas where new materials have been deployed. So this is an example of different monitoring methods yielding different results. And this needs to be taken with a grain of salt, particularly the eDNA stuff, because it focuses only on teleos and which is bony fish, and um, some of the returns that we have preliminarily at least indicate fish that might not actually inhabit the reef but might be inhabiting areas nearby. So there's some fine tuning that needs to go there, but the general take home message here is over time and using different methods as they develop, we can get a better sense of what is there, but no method by itself is going to really tell the whole story. It's getting to some new and ongoing monitoring efforts. The eDNA, as I just discussed, we collected samples in 2023 and 2024. Haven't discussed whether or not we're going to do it in 2025 yet, but I suspect that we will. And we've identified through eDNA more than 30 unique species detections. Additionally, we have acoustic receivers that have been deployed at all our reef sites since 2005, and with the help of other DMF staff, at least Cube in particular, just began an initial assessment of what's out there. We have a year of data to collect for an in-the-fee funded portion of the Yarmouth site, where we are going to utilize that data to assess species productivity. And so, going to get into some lessons learned now relative to some of the partnerships that we've established and some of the folks that we've collaborated with. Community support is essential, and it's important to involve local stakeholders early and often. It's important also to build flexibility into your permits to allow for multiple deployments to sites over the duration of the permits. The permits that we have currently for Nantucket Sound were 10-year permits that were taken out in 2014, and a 5-year extension was granted last year. So that these permits will remain open until 2029 or until we determine that the site has met its capacity in terms of materials. Cape Cod does not really have a suitable shoreside infrastructure for loading materials onto barges. So, considering that in the future and looking at places like New Bedford and Fall River for potential staging areas will have to be factored into any future funding for reef deployments. And we know more about species presence and uses of artificial reefs through the use of different monitoring techniques that we just went through. But there's more to learn. And, some of these techniques continue to evolve. The baited remote underwater video, for example, stereo bruvs are now being used so that not only can you identify the species, but you can get some length metrics on what species are there as well. Um, uh, a big data gap on artificial reef is we know they're being accessed and used, but we don't know to what extent. So, there's some social science work that needs to be done to sort of assess um, the use of artificial reefs. I will say that in our monitoring, particularly in the summertime during the field season, we have we almost always see vessels out there. We always see vessels out there in good weather, and sometimes we see up to 10 vessels at a time utilizing the reef for recreational purposes, which is a good sign. Future collaborative efforts that are under consideration. How do we get materials? How can we identify no-cost materials from other restoration or construction projects that are consistent with the DEP master plan to maximize the diversion of materials from entering landfill waste stream by 2020? We have also developed some specific guidelines in terms of what materials are acceptable. And we incorporate those into our permits as well. So nothing with paint or nothing that would cause any leaching of contaminants into the water are allowable. So it's very specific. Um, Future funding for reef deployments, support from local coastal municipalities or other state agencies is another spot where we could collaborate, given that we don't have any dedicated funding. Um, Deployment streamlining, this is a new thing, direct deployments from the site to the ocean. There's currently a project underway, Collier Ledge in Barnstable, that may actually remove some of that ledge because it's considered to be a hazard to navigation. And rather than deploying that material to an upland source, we're recommending that they just bring it out to the Yarmouth Reef site and deploy it there. Um, in terms of reef science, as I mentioned earlier, social science is of interest here. How are these reefs utilized for recreational and commercial fishing activity? To what degree? Also, are artificial reefs an appropriate mitigation tool for addressing subtidal impacts from coastal alteration projects? And how do the reefs fit into the governor's biodiversity executive order? And how can they be a tool to help DMF address things like climate change going forward? And finally, one of the things that I enjoy mostly about this project is that it's a great collaborative effort amongst the staff here at DMF, and there's so many people I can't thank them all. But over the course of the decades, there have been a suite of DMF employees that have been involved in one form or fashion with artificial reef deployment. So it truly is a collaborative effort, not only outside of our organization, but inside our organization as well. And that's all I have. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mark. So people, you can, if you have a question for Mark, you can just unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat and I'll read them. One question, are there any concerns about pollution caused by aging tires?
Yeah, I thought that question might come out. Absolutely, there's concern about it. I think the best way to answer that question is it's not really clear if removal of the tires would cause would cause more harm than good at this point. But I think that it shouldn't be taken off the table if it's determined at some point that these things are leaching contaminants into the environment, then that conversation needs to be had for sure.
Other questions? So Mark, what's your opinion? Is it attraction? Is the reef, what's the controversy? Is it a reef's attraction? Are you getting new fish because of attraction, or is it actually recruitment?
I think it's a combination of both. And I don't have any specific proof to that aside from observationally. We see fish of various ages on the reef sites in the season. So, yeah, I think that, yeah, it lies somewhere in the middle. And
You
it
get
might
a
also
lot,
be species dependent as well.
so you're getting a lot of, you get a lot of juvenile tautog and black sea bass and scup and stuff out there.
Correct.
Yeah. Other questions?
I got one more. This is Eric, Mark.
Here,
Were reefs historically in off Yarmouth? Is this replacing like a reef that was there?
No, this was a new site. This was the if you dive into the files, there was some concern back in the 70s that the frequency of shipwrecks had started to diminish, and because of that, there was some thought behind um, diminished structured habitat for structure-oriented fish, resulting from the lack of new shipwrecks occurring in that area. So this site was a brand new site. It's a pretty large site. It's a 125 acre site. So I think it's 700 yards across, and it's circular. So it's also the largest site currently permitted in Massachusetts. But I don't think there was anything, to my knowledge, there was nothing there prior.
Great, thanks.
plenty of time for a few more questions. Oh, okay, looks like that's it. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I thank Mark for taking the time and putting together this great presentation. Next week, we're going to have a presentation 3 weeks in a row. It's Derek Perry and from our invertebrate fisheries section, and he's going to talk about the biomedical horseshoe crab fishery. His title is "The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth About the Massachusetts Biomedical Horseshoe Crab Fishery." So I hope to see you then, and I'll send out an announcement with the Zoom link on Friday. All right. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.